magazine since I was told that it's psychologically more comforting for people to see nature during presentations. There's quite good research on biophilia. Always have nature in your things. It helps the people you're talking to. Anyway, let us start. This is Saying No to Normality, which is a talk about something which everyone seems to think is quite normal. Just to give you an idea of where I come from, I come out of sensory design, which is realistically it's accessibility, but I work mostly in physical design, multimodal design, in terms of translating information and meaning between different sensory loads and different sensory capacities. So a lot of my work is museums and also physical environment, but I do work on apps when they have very specific interests in perception or cognition. But one of the things which comes out of the work I do, where I do a lot of testing and I do a lot of work with people with different cognitive capacities, different physical capacities, is that I don't end up caring about the impairments. Most people, and this is one of the traps, people keep designing for impairments rather than people, because impairments are obvious and simple. And yet capacities, the ways in which people live their lives, the ways in which they create and make and do, are much more broad and much more interesting. And one of the reasons why I work to capacity rather than incapacity, impairment and so forth, is that I find human beings infinitely interesting. And the other side of this is, and particularly in the work I'm doing now on design for autism and dementia, is that I'm finding a lot of the ways in which we talk and a lot of the tools we use don't work. And they don't work because they're designed for normality. And they exist on the basis that normality is good. And after a few years of work, I have come to the conclusion that I really don't like normality. It's not working. It's not working because it's a historical thing, and it's not working because the tools and the things it's creating won't help us in the future. But in order to get you to understand why normality is bad, it's probably worth going through a bit of history. So here are a couple of books. I will have a book list during this thing, just in case you do want references. The End of Average is a very good book, and it is very readable. I would recommend it. Normality is an extremely extensive and almost unreadable academic book. I do not recommend you read it. It is very good, though. But what you get to, 180 years of normality. We haven't been normal for as long as you would imagine. It's about 180 years, and you have to go to Scotland, and you have to go to a Belgian man called Quetelet. Quetelet, in the 1840s, started doing statistical work. He, very particularly, and his big show-off thing was this, analysing the chest measurements of Scottish troops. 5,738 Scottish soldiers, you get the average measurement of 39 3/4, for which that is realistic the first good or the most meaningful use of the idea of average. He got an average and he was able to apply it to soldiers. He also then went on to invent the body mass index, which also has issues for those of us who are short and fat. But what he came up with, and where we get to, is what we're going to have is a narrative which builds over the 180 years into something that we really shouldn't have done. But where you start with is, he starts with the idea that there is an average, and the average is normal. And that's kind of okay. But then you start falling into the idea that deviance from the average, being on the wrong side of the bell curve, is an error. That deviance is wrong. And that gets caught up with Galton, who turns up in the 1890s. And he turns up, and Galton, who was also an inventor of eugenics, which also didn't turn out very well. Galton had the idea of the ranked man. So he took the idea of the bell curve, the idea you have a normal, and then he added these 12 categories. He categorized humans. So he took humans and he said, well, there's the eminent, and then at the other end there is the imbecile. The idea that the ranks, that the average, the normal, goes from the eminent, the good, down to the bad, the imbeciles, starts with Galton. But, and if you want to find the most, in a conversation where a man who invents eugenics is not the most evil person I can come across, Thorndike is actually the worst person. Thorndike is the guy who most of the educational theory we work with nowadays, the idea of tests and exams, all of those things that made your childhood hellish, Thorndike mostly caused it, because he took the idea that you could measure in order to be able to create tests to find quality, because only quality people mattered to him. It's an 1890s, it's a reflection of the ideas of Taylorism and scientific management. If you have workers, then you need managers. And you need to find managers who are quality. Top quality managers. Because they can then run the factories. They can then manage all of these fools. And you get a whole system of education, of tests, which is only interested in finding top quality people. The A stars, the magna cum laudes. They're the only ones who matter, because that's all you cared about. And yet we live with that system now. So there are consequences, and the consequences are the things we live with now. That we took the idea that there is the ability, innocently, to take calculations, to use mathematics, to say we can record data, we can create bell curves, we can say here is the average, here is the mean. But the problem is it got hijacked, and it got hijacked really early, to have a narrative, and to have a narrative that really shouldn't be there. Because the narrative is this. Normality is based around the idea that there are people who are superior, and that those people have greater worth in our society. Those people deserve better things. Those people should be in control. And then on the other side of it, in a system which has quality people at one side and imbeciles at the other, of course it's going to create inequality. If you're going to normalize, if you're going to create a normalized system, you are going to create inequality. It's inherent in the thing you're doing. And coming from accessibility, this is the point. When people talk to me about, statistical numbers of people with certain impairments and disabilities, what we're doing is making edge cases. People with impairments, people with disabilities are not edge cases. There are no edge cases, because we make them. We use the normalization, we use the averaging, we use the maths, which we think is innocent and all fine, but it isn't. It has these consequences. We made the edge cases because we made the averages, and then we made judgments about deviance, error, quality, imbeciles. So when I talk about sort of accessibility and inclusive design, the point is almost everything we do, the way in which we research, the way in which we use research, the way in which we design product, all of these things are based on tools which work on averages, which work on consensuses, which create exclusion. It's embedded in the thing we're doing. So there's a problem. We think norms are fine. We don't worry about normative things. And we don't worry about normality. And we should. Because the society we have, the products we make, all of these things, come out of a narrative which is 180 years old and which has created the things that we're saying we don't like. And yet they're built into the tools we use. So, how do we design for a post-normality environment? How do we stop doing the thing which we do? These two books are interesting. Kate Raworth's Donut Economics is very good. Homo Deus I loathed with a passion, which I can't explain here, but it's interesting. But, God, no. Within it, and both of them have it, both of them have the idea of rational economics and rational economic man. And this is the idea, the average man. Again, we created the idea of the rational economic man. Sadly, this slide doesn't work. But that says the rational economic man must die. Because he must die, because he's awful. Because he doesn't exist. This is the other thing which is really interesting about all of this stuff, is almost everything which we're modeling against, everything we're thinking we're trying to design for is imaginary in bizarre ways. So, for example, when talking about rational economic man, Black-Scholes model, this is really boring, but Black-Scholes model, it's a model for pricing bonds. Somebody won a, well, Black-Scholes won, they both won a Nobel Prize for it. It's a bond pricing model, and it's a mathematical model for how bonds are priced, and I'm sure people in Canary Wharf would be thrilled. But when people actually tested Black-Scholes model against bond market performance, the deviation was about 40%. The model did not work. The model did not perform. And yet, a few years later, deviance was 2%. Model was working. But the point was the model wasn't working. The model remains the same. What had happened was this. People were complying to the model. The model was defining the reality. The bond traders believed the model was real and behaved as though it was real, and therefore it became real. And this is always slightly problematic when you're talking about humans and design, because humans comply to concepts, new concepts particularly. We're very open to new concepts. We have mental model, which is fine, but new concepts, they're sticky, they're interesting. And so people comply to concept. But of course, that is within a context. You can't have me tell you a new idea if I'm dressed in a clown's suit and standing on the beach. But if I'm standing in front of you in a theatre looking very serious, then you might believe me, because the context is defining the meaning of my words. I'm more believable at the moment than I would be in other places. Ish. But humans are compliant to context of place. And the most interesting theory about human behaviour which I've come across lately is Schoder, which is contextualised entities. Which is, and it is very, very obvious, it is that people behave dependent upon the context of the place, the time, the issue they're in. If, then. And this is one which particularly you see going wrong in schools, where we have disruptive pupils. And the person is condemned to be disruptive forever. But the point is, the person is only probably disruptive in the school. The context of the school, the context of the teacher, the context of the class is driving the behaviour, not the person overall. Because it's context then behaviour. You can't just behavioural design. You have to understand contexts, because the contexts are what people are working in. People live their lives within contexts. And they change their personalities, they change their capacities, dependent upon those contexts. So any work, you have to research and understand context, because the behavior is inherently based in that. So it's context, then behavior, always. But of course, behavior keeps turning up in stuff nowadays. We have the idea of normal behavior, which of course is a strange idea. But of course, now we have, and if you read a lot of the literature now, we are very much interested in weird behavior. And weird is not necessarily what you think it is. Because if we're designing for diversity, if we're designing for post-normal, if we're designing for an idea that humanity is divergent and diverse, then we must look at diversity. And one of the ways in which a lot of the issues are being framed at the moment, and a lot of the literature, is within the idea of weird, which is actually an acronym, which stands for this. Which is, there is actually a much ruder version of this, which I can't show you, but if you see me later, I can tell you. There is, it's very funny though. It's the 5 Ps, I think. This is a problem. Because almost all the research we have is based upon people who are like this. And this is why you should not trust research that you read in books. I read books a lot. But always be wary, because things are going slightly strange when research is being reviewed. So always read books warily, and do research. One of the things which has just come up, and I only came across this a couple of weeks ago. Does anyone know this one? Which line is longer? Sorry? Yes, is that because you know this trick? Yeah. Yes. Okay, you know this trick. This trick is a visual trick, which is a perception trick, and tricks and tricks. The thing is, it was only just discovered, probably in the last 10 years or so, that this trick is not universal. It was always assumed that this was a universal, rather like emotion in faces research. There was an assumption that this stuff was universal, and it isn't. It's culturally bounded. What they found when they started testing in, I think it's the Himbe tribe in Africa, was they could quite clearly see that there was no longer line. They were not fooled by the trick. Because the trick is based in something that nobody had actually bothered to think about. The trick is based around the fact that this works if you are used to rectilinear architecture. Because we in the West, and most of the people we know in most places, live in architectures which have got straight lines. Our perception systems are very, very caught up by straight lines. Himbe tribe live in an area which is both natural and also their architecture is rounded. The trick doesn't work because they're not actually socialized to it. So when people talk about research which is universal, be very wary, because there's a lot of stuff which isn't, particularly social psychology. Under no circumstances trust social psychology research. Somebody did this analysis. So the Journal of Social Psychology is the biggest of the journals for social psychology research, which is lovely. But somebody did actually backtrack through their research to see how much of their research was weird, i.e. how many of their participants were white, European, industrialized, rich, democratic. It's 96%. So fundamentally, most social psychology research will tell you what Brad in California thinks, which is nice, but not necessarily terribly helpful. So we just don't know enough. We have a lot of research, but we just can't trust it because it's so biased. We don't know how humans act, react, behave, because we've never actually bothered asking that many people. So 2 ideas of how to look at post-normal design. One is the fairly obvious and endlessly stated diversity, which, of course, people talk diversity when they're doing normal design, but then, of course, the whole of the process, and if you look at Double Diamond, is designed around consensus and eliminating any divergences, which doesn't make any sense. You can't have divergence in a system which is actually deliberately eliminating divergence. Good books. Both of these books are very good. Humble Inquiry is very good. I use that a lot. Indigenous research methodologies, possibly slightly obscure, but very good, particularly in co-design terms. If you're trying to look at other ways of researching which do not use Western concepts, I use that quite a lot in co-design workshops and also usability workshops, because I need to understand how, particularly, I can transfer power away from myself. I mean, within this, look for more people and listen more, and listen humbly. This may slightly weird people out. I don't actually care about bias in research, because for the most part, I'm looking at the bias problem is, generally speaking, a bias which is held by the researchers, and they don't recognize it in themselves. And the power is normally a thing which the researchers hold and yet don't recognize in themselves. I spend most of my time wondering about power and power dynamics in workshops. Think about how you can pass power. How can you truthfully expect people to tell you their truths if you have power over them? We must eliminate power. We must share power. The second thing is data and taking care with data, because, as was shown in the beginning, it's very easy to use data and use mathematical operations as though they're innocent. But they aren't, because the way we use them creates effects, and those effects have now been washing over us now for nigh on 2 centuries. So when using data in projects, think about the way you use it. Before, think about where your data sets come from. I mean, you see this particularly in any of the AI stuff nowadays. Amazon's recruitment system, which ended up being wildly sexist, because it used data which demonstrated that Amazon's recruitment process was wildly sexist. So if you're going to use data sets, understand what your data set shows. Because if you're going to inject it into a product design, you will have consequences. Always see what you're about to do. As I say, doing the averaging stuff, which seems like one of those casually easy things to do, it has consequences. There's a whole area of neonatal research where they actually only found the answers once they stopped averaging, because the averages were actually hiding the solution. Don't do things simply because you've always done them. Take responsibility and pay attention to what you do, because it can get you somewhere which you weren't expecting. And after, have you recorded divergences? As I say, within a lot of processes, particularly design thinking processes, divergences are allowed and then dismissed. And when dismissing the divergence, when dismissing the diversity, don't lose it. There's no point being interested in divergence and diversity if you just put it in the bin. you must respect it. There's no point doing it otherwise. And all of this is about ethics. And there is a lot about ethics coming up by people who are much better at ethics than I am. So do stay for those talks. So there are two things. Look for diversity of people. Pay attention to what you do with data. And within all of this, understand that normality is a trap. Normality traps us from seeing how extraordinary humanity is. Normality stops us from actually designing new products which meet the needs of a greater number of people. This is the general view of the bell curve. There is another way of looking at it. That normality, the idea of the average, the idea of the normal, is a pit. It's a trap. It holds you in so you cannot see the possibilities. You cannot see what's available. And the reason we should deal with more humane design, the reason why humanity is so important, is because humanity will save us. The diversity of people around us, the diversity of people, those are the people who rescue us from the idea of normality. Those are the people who will pull us out from this thing which has trapped us, the idea that the average, the idea that quality, top quality, the elite matter. So, fundamentally, one should say no to normality, and one should say yes to humanity. And that's it. Thank you.